Good evening and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we are starting a new section and we're getting into Chapter 5 about immigrants and immigration during the late 1800s. Learning targets: compare the immigration that is happening after the Civil War to the immigration that was coming before the Civil War. And we're going to explain the push and pull factors. So why America was good, those are pull factors, and why their old country was bad, those are push factors. We're going to describe the challenges that the immigrants had in traveling to America, and we'll analyze how immigrants adapted to American life while at the same time trying to maintain their familiar cultural practices. So up until the Civil War, immigration was coming from Northern and Western Europe, and we had Irish Catholics and German Protestants, and these people were not as discriminated against, number one, because the Irish speak English, and the Germans are known, they share a religion with most of the people in America, and they're known to be good workers. So those kinds of people were they were still discriminated against, but they were still accepted because they were white and they had things in common with America. This new wave of immigration is coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And these are Eastern Catholics, which is a completely different religion from the Western Roman Catholics, and Jews. They're coming from places like Italy, Greece, Poland, Hungary, Russia, and these people are poor. They're coming to America. Means they only really can live in a cheap house in a city. A lot of them plan to actually earn their money in America, then return home. That's why there's a debate whether or not immigration in America is really made up of all these immigrants, because a lot of them just used America as a means to better their family. And these different cultures and languages from these new wave of immigration, this causes discrimination against these people. The push and pull factors: what's going on in the countries back home? Well, they're persecuted for either their religion or their race or something back home in Southern and Eastern Europe. Economic hardships, so they're poor, there's lack of jobs, and there's also wars going on during this time. And the pull are the religious and political freedom that are going on in America. The Homestead Act, which provides cheap land out to the west. Factory jobs, plentiful factory jobs, and maybe some of them already have family here in the U.S., so they'll be comfortable traveling here. What different travels did we face? What were the hard parts of traveling to America? Well, immigrants could only travel in steerage, or the crowded, dirty lower decks of steamships. If you've ever seen the movie Titanic, that is a great depiction of steerage, although it's pretty clean compared to the steerage conditions that immigrants usually traveled in. That's a luxury ship. They were more like this. You could only bring what you could carry. If it was a suitcase, that's fine, but you had to stuff all your possessions, all your lifelong belongings into a bag and bring them to America. Illness spread, even though the ship owners did medical screenings beforehand. Some people died actually along the trip to America because if they weren't healthy, they didn't let them go. But what if the illness was incubating inside a person's body and then decided to spread while the person was on the ship? A lot of people would get sick. They have to be healthy, and they have to prove when they come to America that they either have a skill they can use, which a lot of them didn't, money, which a lot of them didn't, or a sponsor, which a lot of them did. Someone in America to vouch for you, saying you're not a bad person and you can get into America, you won't commit crimes, and you're going to work hard to try to better your family.
Steamships were used. When heading to New York, immigrants traveled across the Atlantic on a ship for 3 weeks in crowded below-deck quarters called steerage. They ate black bread, boiled potatoes, and water soup. As the immigrants sailed into New York Harbor, they sailed past the Statue of Liberty on their way to Ellis Island. When the immigrants saw the Statue of Liberty, they knew they had arrived in the United States. Once the immigrants reach the United States, they usually have to wait on board the ship for days because the immigration station was so crowded. Everybody coming to America had to check in at an immigration station before they were allowed to live here. This is where they kept track of everyone entering the country. But not everyone who came to America got to stay. If an immigrant was sick, he or she might be forced to go back to his or her country. In 1892, Ellis Island welcomed 17 million people to America. On the West Coast, immigrants usually landed at the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. Millions of these arriving immigrants stay in the cities where they landed. On the East Coast, that was New York City. For most immigrants, these cities were a whole new world. New York was like no other place they had ever seen. Many immigrants had lived on small farms in Europe and had hoped to buy land in the United States, but very few could afford to do that. So they often settled into crowded neighborhoods. A lot of immigrants live with relatives or friends in poorly built apartments called tenements. Tenement life was a hard one. 5 to 6 people would have to sleep in one tiny room.
And in 1892, this is when Ellis Island opens specifically to process immigrants. And most third-class steerage immigrants are processed at Ellis Island. They conduct legal inspections and medical inspections here. The Chinese and Asian immigrants were processed at Angel Island on the west coast in San Francisco Bay. So you want a mnemonic device to remember that. Ellis Island is Europeans, they're both E, and Angel Island is Asians, both A's. Due to racism, the Chinese had to prove that they were American citizens or that they had relatives living in America. Sometimes they were held for weeks, while European immigrants were held for just hours, and so a lot of racism against the non-white Asian immigrants coming to America. Living conditions in the cities, they live next to their low-skill industrial jobs, so they live right next to factory districts in cities. Usually different ethnicities would sort of team up and live together, or I'm sorry, the same ethnicity would, and they would be called ghettos because they were in such short and small supply and crammed quarters that they would live with other people from their country, same culture, same food, same clothing, make them feel more comfortable here in America. That's a ghetto that they lived in. The melting pot versus nativism argument. Some people in America welcomed these immigrants with open arms, and they set up Americanization programs, or to become American. They wanted these immigrants to become Americans, so they helped them learn English and adopt American dress and diet, and basically how to be American. And this is the melting pot argument. White people of all different cultures blend together to form one distinct culture. Notice I said white people. There were no blacks in the melting pot, no Asians in the melting pot. They didn't include them, but they included all the white people from Europe. Nativists, think of the root word there, native, feel that native-born white Americans are superior to immigrants. They resent these immigrants because they provide competition for housing and jobs. These religious and cultural differences in such close quarters in the cities sparked suspicion between the groups. Scientists even did studies saying that immigrants' physical characteristics are actually linked to lower intelligence and criminal behavior. But as scientists now, we know those studies were not reliable or valid. Here are some other reaction against immigrants. We've already talked about the Know Nothing Party. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which we'll talk about in a second, Congress passed this law limiting Chinese immigration after some native-born or nativists labeled immigration from Asia a, quote, yellow peril. And so they already, in California, had barred Chinese from owning property or working at certain jobs. And now this will limit the amount of immigration that can come from China. And literacy tests were passed in quotas, limiting the number of immigrants who could come each year to about 350,000. And then the Racist National Origins Act in 1924 basically said more people can come from Western Europe than from any other country, but still put a quota in place. So this cartoon is kind of pointing out the hypocrisy that these native-born white people faced. They are telling immigrants that they cannot come over when it was their ancestors that actually came over and made themselves as part of the first wave of immigration. We already talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the lasting effects of immigration. Well, immigrants basically redefined what it means to be American. They fuel industrial growth by being the ones to work in these dark, dirty factories. They become active in labor unions and politics. They help to elect politicians. The immigrant group is a very big voting bloc. They become part of American culture. A lot of our traditions today are from immigrants who came over and brought it from their country. And their labor helped America become a world economic power. And that's all I have for you today. Remember to fill out those learning targets, check off those sub-targets, and I will see you later. Good night.